My name is Emily Davidson, and I will be presenting on Jesus and women. I'm actually in the college at Southwestern, or Scarborough, I guess is what it's called now, but this is my last semester, but I had to move to Arkansas because my husband took a youth pastor position. So I'm finishing my last two classes via master's classes online. So I'm really excited about my topic. I, prior to coming to Southwestern, probably would not have been called a complementarian. I probably would have called myself a Christian feminist or something to that effect. But I hadn't studied at all what it meant to follow the Lord and be a woman and be a Christian. And so since coming to Southwestern, I've taken biblical womanhood classes and really studied these things more closely. And so when I saw my topic, I was excited because I've really come to appreciate and value the value that Jesus put on women. So yes, I'm first going to talk a little bit about the culture at the time of Jesus' time and go back a little bit and look at the Old Testament and the rules that were in place for women and why they were there. And then look at a few cases where Jesus interacts with the untouchables or less than reputable women. And then lastly, I'm going to look at mainly focus. I think most of my paper will be on Mary and Martha because those are the most consistent relationships he has. You see him interact with them 3 different times. So yeah, those will be kind of the general outline of my presentation and my paper once I finish that. So first, looking at the culture of women in the first century, actually going back to the Old Testament. If we look at Leviticus, for one, people who don't study the Bible but hear things or might read a little bit will often say, wow, the Old Testament is so oppressive to women. There are all these rules about patriarchal, being under men, being under their fathers, being under their husbands, and if their husband dies, they just get a new husband. They don't get a choice. They don't get to keep their money. They don't, all these things. When we study those more closely, we see that the Lord put these rules in place to protect women at that time, that he arranged so that if their husband died, they wouldn't remain a widow, but they would have a new source of income. But it is true that women, if they made something, if they did something to receive income, that immediately went to whichever male was above them, whether that be their father or when they marry their husband, or if they're a widow, their husband's brother who they marry, or their brother, whatever, the male highest above them. So these things were carried on into Jesus' time, obviously, and actually a little bit more extreme. As the Pharisees did, they would take the basic commandments of the Old Testament and apply so many more boundaries and rules, which originally I would say was from a good place. They wanted to create more boundaries in order to obey the law and obey God, but it created extreme space between men and women, or between, as we've been studying, between Jesus and Jesus broke down all barriers, but between people, between Jews and Samaritans, etc. There was just a lot of barriers that, of course, Jesus broke down and did not, as he says, did not abolish the law, but fulfilled it. He brought new life to these things. So Jesus didn't come in like a crazy radical, he didn't, as far as we know, he didn't marry, and he wasn't crazy with women, but he was respectful, and he addressed them in ways that was not socially acceptable at the time. So just to kind of list some things, women in Jesus' time primarily stayed at home. They were not educated. What they knew of the Bible was very basic, and the Bible being the Old Testament, obviously. They were given instruction by their father or their husband. They would be under their father until approximately the age of 13 and 15, and then be engaged and married off. And then they remained in the home, and they had children, and they took care of their home, and that was their place. If they were out and about, they did not interact with males in public. And this is actually something we still see in some Middle Eastern places. So my husband and I went to Egypt last spring break, and you'll see this there, at least in the older generations. You'll see that men and women really don't interact in public, and you certainly don't see married women interacting with different married men. With the younger generations, you see a little bit more. But anyways, so also Levitical law prohibited women who were unclean, whether that be from birth or from their cycle or from some kind of sickness, to interact with other people. And so that was still the case when Jesus was on the earth. And so we'll look at some stories in which he really breaks down these boundaries and cares for women who were considered untouchable. So first, we see in John 7:53 through 8:11. I won't read these first few because I'm kind of just highlighting these. But we see Jesus with the adulterous woman. And we all know the story. This woman is brought before Jesus by, I think, several Pharisees and men. I could probably find reference or find the passage. But and they say, this woman's committed adultery. What do we do? And Jesus says, let he who is innocent, who is without sin, cast the first stone. And it says from the oldest to the youngest, walk away slowly. It says he writes something in the dirt, and we don't know what that is. But I read some commentaries and some theologians on this, and many say that these Pharisees would, again, this is from a theologian's perspective. We don't know this to be true. This isn't in the exegetical passage, but often the men had no consequences for committing adultery. So it's very possible that these men that he was saying cast the first stone had even used this woman, or had slept around. And so in that culture, women committing adultery, it was a death sentence, but for men there was no retribution. So we watch the men walk away, and then Jesus gently tells her she's been forgiven and to sin no more. So that's our first, just kind of Jesus, one, speaking to an adulterous woman, and two, forgiving her of her sins and being kind and gentle to her rather than stoning her as was the law. Next, we see in John 4 that Jesus interacts with the Samaritan woman at the well. And again, we know the story. He comes up, he asks for a drink of water, and even she's shocked that he's speaking to her because, one, she's a Samaritan, and two, she's a woman. And so by both those things, Jesus is breaking cultural boundaries because he's interacting. Jews did not speak to Samaritans, and men did not speak to women. And then we go on to find out that she's not only a woman, but she's been married, I think, 5 times and is living with a man that isn't even her husband. So this is not a woman of a good reputation, and Jesus knows that. But he speaks to her with truth. He gives her the truth. He talks about living water. And this unreputable woman goes on to share who he is and share about Jesus to her entire town. And so Jesus uses this woman of a bad reputation to reach these people and to share who he is. And then third of my basic highlights, we have the bleeding woman who reaches out and touches Jesus' shirt, in Mark 5:25 through 43. And so again, we know the story. Jesus is walking to go heal the dying child, and this woman reaches out and he says, "Who touched me?" And of course his disciples are like, "There are people everywhere. Lots of people are touching you." But he says he felt the power go out of him. And so he turns and she apologizes because she's unclean. So for her to touch him is essentially to make him unclean. People, with leprosy or bleeding or whatever, couldn't touch clean people. It made them unclean. And so she apologizes, and he says, "No, your faith has made you well." Also, I wanted to point out, in so many of these passages, those that I've mentioned and those that I haven't, Jesus frequently refers to women as daughter, which is very gentle and affectionate, and not something that men typically did. And so that's just a really cool little tidbit about the way that Jesus is so gentle and kind to women in ways that men did not at the time. So those are kind of just my 3 quick highlights of women that Jesus probably should not, according to the law, interact with, but he did with such gentleness. And he, in all 3 cases, he frees them from their sin. He tells the adulterous woman, "Go, be freed, sin no more." He acknowledges the Samaritan woman's sin and brings her to know truth. And then he frees the bleeding woman, one, from her physical ailment, but then also is in kind and tells her that her faith has healed her. So now I want to focus more seriously on Mary and Martha. I've always loved Mary and Martha because I think all people, but specifically all women, can relate to one side or the other, at least in the initial story. So let's read that really briefly. In Luke 10:38 through 42, we see, let me find it, sorry. So we see that Jesus has gone to stay with Mary and Martha and Lazarus. And Martha is doing what she's supposed to do as a woman. Let me just read this real quick. It says, "Now as they went on their way, Jesus entered a village, and a woman named Martha welcomed him into her house. And she had a sister named Mary who sat at the Lord's feet and listened to his teaching. But Martha was distracted with much serving, and she went up to him and said, 'Lord, do you not care that my sister has left me to serve alone? Tell her then to help me.' But the Lord answered her, 'Martha, Martha, you are anxious and troubled about many things, but one thing is necessary. Mary has chosen the good portion, which will not be taken away from her.'" And that was Luke 10:38 through 42 ESV. So we see in this passage, Martha's doing what she was supposed to do as a woman. She is being hospitable, and she is cooking, and she's cleaned, and she's taking care of the guests in her home. And then there's Mary, who does what is not culturally acceptable. Women did not go and listen to teaching from scholars, from the Pharisees, from whoever. They stayed in their home, they did their work. There was not a lot of learning and educating women. And so rather than helping her sister, she's sitting at Jesus' feet. And Martha appeals to Jesus' humanity as a Jew and says, "This is not what she should be doing. Please tell my sister to come help me." And I've been there, and all women have been there, where it's a lot easier to, especially if you're type A like me, follow the list and say, "I need to do this and this and this and this, and this is how I will serve the Lord." But Jesus, at least, I don't want to read into the passage, but it sounds gentle because he says, "Martha, Martha, you are anxious and troubled about many things." He doesn't reprimand her, but he's just curbing her, saying, these are good things, but this is not what you are to be focused on right now. Mary has chosen the good portion, and this will not be taken away from her. So Mary, by sitting by his feet and choosing to spend time with him and learn from him, has chosen the correct thing. And so if I were Martha, I'd be slightly offended because I'm doing what I'm supposed to be doing. But Jesus commends Mary for being eager to learn and to grow and to seek him. So our next passage is John 11:1 through 44. And this is Lazarus' death. And so we see, I won't read this whole passage because it's pretty long, but a message is sent to him saying, Lazarus is dying, come quick. And of course, we know Jesus extends his stay and waits until Lazarus has died and then comes. And so we see that when he gets there, Martha runs up to him and says, "If you had been here, my brother wouldn't have died." And then here, let me read this part real quick. She says, "But even now I know that whatever you ask for from God, God will give you." And I was reading a couple sources. Of course, I'll cite all of these in my paper. But and they talk about how this statement of faith is in some ways more serious than even when Peter commends Jesus as Lord or says that Jesus is Lord. Because this is a woman, and she's in this time of grief saying, "Jesus, I know that you are still powerful and you are God." And so Jesus says, "Your brother will rise again." And Martha said to him, "I know that he will rise again in the resurrection on the last day." Jesus said to her, "I am the resurrection and the life. Whoever believes in me, though he die, yet shall he live. And everyone who lives and believes in me shall never die. Do you believe this?" And here, she said to him, "Yes, Lord, I believe that you are the Christ, the Son of God, who is coming into the world." And so here, after the first situation where we see Martha has not chosen the right thing, in this passage, it's so cool because we just see that Martha has so much faith that she, even in this time of grief and pain, she is showing that she trusts the Lord and putting faith in him. And then, very similar, Mary comes, And, well, Martha goes to Mary and says, the teacher's here and is calling for you. And so Mary goes, and she says the same thing. She says, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. And they don't have quite the same conversation, but she weeps, and Jesus weeps with her. So we see that this family, Lazarus and Mary and Martha, are very important to Jesus. And Jesus knows what's coming. Jesus knows that he's about to raise Lazarus from the dead. But because he cares for these women, he weeps with them. Just as he teaches, he mourns with those who are mourning. And so we get to see Jesus's compassion and empathy and humanity in this moment, which is really cool. And so then we go on, and there's not much more with Mary and Martha, except that their brother is raised from the dead. And so everyone praises Jesus because he's raised Lazarus from the dead. And then lastly, and this one's a little bit trickier. So there are three accounts of a woman, or maybe it is four, a woman washing Jesus' feet. But only one of them gives the account in the name of it. It's Mary from Bethany, Mary Martha, who is washing his feet. I think another one refers to a woman of ill repute, so most likely a prostitute. And then the other one just says, the other one or two just says a woman. And so this is kind of interesting. I think it was two or three, the majority of them say that he was in the area of Bethany, but not all of them say that. So there's some confusion about within the Synoptic Gospels of whether Jesus, this happened more than once, whether several women anointed him, or if perhaps this was all Mary or what.